East King Chambers Coalition webcast for May 12, 2020. Today we're joined by Washington State Senate Budget Chair Christine Rolfes, Senate Finance and Economic Development Chair Mark Mullet, and House Finance Committee Vice Chair Amy Walen as they discuss dollars and cents, Washington State's budget.
Thank you for joining us for our third East King Chambers Coalition webcast. I'm Joe Fain, CEO of the Bellevue Chamber. The coalition brings together 11 chambers on the east side to develop a joint legislative agenda in Olympia and bring our state's decision makers and local business leaders face to face. I'd like to start by thanking our coalition sponsors, Puget Sound Energy, Seattle-King County Realtors, Comcast, the Port of Seattle, Boeing, and Microsoft. We've got a special program today, and there's lots of ground to cover, so please use the Q&A and chat feature on your screen to send in questions for our panelists as we discuss a very important but also a very troubling issue. When legislators left town in mid-March, there was already grumbling about the potential fiscal impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. Legislators passed a budget that trimmed back on some of their earlier proposals, and at the beginning of April, Governor Inslee was forced to veto hundreds of millions in spending increases passed by lawmakers. But that was just a drop in the bucket. The state now faces billions in shortfalls, which could force lawmakers back to Olympia as early as this summer. What's on the table? We're joined by some key legislators that will have to make those tough decisions. Beginning with the chief budget writer in the Senate, Ways and Means Chair, Senator Christine Rolfes. Senator, welcome. How are you handling this, and what's on your mind?
Probably the same thing going through a lot of people's heads. I want to give folks just a general overview of what how the legislature ended in mid-March, and then what we're looking at right now, if that's okay, Joe. So I'll just do a brief overview then. As most of you know, we had 60 days to write a budget. When we came in January, Washington State's economy was roaring. We had one of the best bond ratings in the entire country. We were ranked last year as one of the top 10 states for creating a recession-proof budget that we would be able to weather any recession thrown our way in the next couple of years. And so when we got together in January, even though the economy was very strong, the Senate at least proposed a budget that we felt was recession-proof, that anticipated a small decline in the economic growth in the state. When we got together with the House towards the end of February, the coronavirus was just starting to be talked about. We included a $10 million line item in the draft budget that was agreed to by the House and Senate at the end of February. That amount increased to $100 million by the time we finalized our budget. And then on the last day of session, we agreed unanimously in both chambers to appropriate $200 million right from the rainy day fund into what we call a disaster assistance account, but it's an emergency fund that can be spent at the governor's discretion. So when we left Olympia, we had made that coronavirus investment, and we had left kind of an unprecedented $3 billion in reserves over the next 2 years to make sure that we could withstand a recession that looked like it was coming faster than anyone had anticipated. Having said that, nobody anticipated that 2 weeks later, the entire state's economy would be shut down, as well as the rest of the country and the global economy. So as Joe said, what we're looking at now is an unprecedented decline in revenue to the state. And those are the taxes collected, because clearly the state's not collecting business taxes and sales taxes when business is not operating. So the number we got a couple of weeks ago, was in the realm of about $4 to $5 billion in revenue gap. With a $3 billion reserve, clearly the reserves aren't going to cover the revenue decline that we're seeing. So the legislature is going to have very difficult conversations. To summarize, we have enough money to make it through this fiscal year, which ends on at the end of June. So we don't have an emergency need to get back in to make reappropriations, but we would be wise to meet in a special session sometime before January to be able to reduce spending and make spending adjustments where needed. So we're looking at we'll get better numbers in June and we'll target for that. But we're looking at somewhere in the billions of dollars in reduced spending, right when a lot of our citizens are going to need it the most.
Help folks understand the magnitude of the budget and what $4 to $5 billion means. I know that, even after a couple of years on the Ways and Means Committee, it still was sometimes gibberish to me. What is what percentage of the budget is that kind of a figure, and kind of more importantly, how much flexibility do legislators have, given that so much of the state budget is kind of locked in place?
Yeah, that's where it gets tricky. That's a great question. The budget as we left Olympia was a $52 billion 2-year budget, $52 billion, so about $26 billion a year. Based on revenue, it's now more of like a $48 billion budget, but you can see the math, roughly $50 billion. So the decline we're looking at is, 10%, a 10% decrease in the revenues we were anticipating. The number that gets thrown around by the press is between $7 and $8 billion. Right now, that's a 4-year budget number. So I want folks to know the state constitution requires a balanced budget. All states have to balance their budgets. We don't print money. So we do a 2-year balanced budget. Our state is the only state in the country that also does balances our budget over 4 years. And so the out years, the 3rd and 4th year of any budget planning cycle, are more iffy in terms of forecasts. But it does allow us to look at spending and have a better approximation for what spending decisions will look like out into the future. So what we're looking at is roughly $5 billion out of $50 billion, right? So a little less than 10%. Half of that is actually not state spending at all. It's money that's collected on behalf of school districts and then sent back out to 301 school districts around the state. So then when we're looking at what are the numbers we're looking at, we can't cut school funding. That's constitutionally required. So as Joe knows, then we start looking at the other half of the pie, and that's mostly half of that is healthcare spending. And then you look at prisons, foster care, higher education. People always tend to go after the Department of Ecology. A lot of folks, Ecology, Department of Natural Resources, state parks, the resource agencies are very, very small part of the budget, maybe 5% of the budget.
We've seen literally trillions of dollars come out of the federal government for supporting unemployment, for small business, but we haven't seen a lot of funding that is going to prop up state or local budgets. What's your sense about further rounds of COVID support out of Congress, and whether or not the state or local cities are going to have any part of that?
We just got a tranche of money specifically for local government and state government for COVID response. So the money that governments have been spending on healthcare, hospitals, testing, public health, that stuff should be covered. But all of the local governments are going to be looking at the same budget challenges that the state government's looking at. The last that I heard, the counties were looking at 20% decreases in their tax collections. So that's pretty significant. What we're hoping is that when that money was sent out originally for COVID, a state like Washington got a little bit penalized because we were doing our budget right around the time that COVID was becoming an issue. So within our budget, we sent out additional money to rural hospitals, rural clinics. We increased the amounts that we reimburse hospitals for. We increased the amounts that ambulances get reimbursed for. We propped up the healthcare system. We put a lot of money into homelessness for the first time, just direct sheltering, which turned out to be very, very helpful as part of the COVID response. But none of that can be reimbursed through COVID, even though it was to address COVID. So we are hoping that the federal government will be more flexible, because we just aren't. I don't think we're going to have $1 billion in COVID expenses over the next 8 months that aren't already embedded in our budget. So we're hoping for some flexibility, and we all know that once the governments start laying people off, that's your second wave of recession. And so hopefully we're anticipating and hoping for some flexibility from Congress on the federal health.
I was looking at an interesting document out of the governor's office. It was showed a chart of the economic impact of particular industries compared to the likelihood of COVID transmission, and so a very important decision-making metric or matrix for figuring out which and how to open certain industries. Has the legislature looked at that through a budget lens at all? Is there a sense of, X number of further days of the stay-at-home order or of reduced economic activity equals Y in terms of reduced funding to state government?
We have not looked at that. We're not in session right now, so the Ways and Means Committee had our first debrief, I guess you would say. We had our first update last week with the entire committee, where we got all the information about what the final budget looks like after the vetoes, what the federal money coming in is going to be used for, what the forecasts are for. We have not done the level of analysis related to the economy. And the governor has a phased-in approach that's really based on public health versus, I don't know that, at least I haven't seen the economic analysis weighing in on we need to get these businesses up and running faster. It's really about health. And you can debate that one way or the other, but it's clear, it's pretty clear on the ground that at this point, consumer confidence is just as much about economics as it is about the feeling about whether citizens feel safe shopping. Do they feel safe going to restaurants? You don't want to make employees go to work in a situation that's not going to protect their health. So the public health part of this is it's interwoven in a way that we've never really considered that before.
Any prognostications? I know that's an impossible projection to make, but is there any sense that these declines in government revenue is a 1-year issue, a 4-year issue? Is this relatable to the Great Recession, or is there some optimism that it may bounce back faster?
There's just no precedent. So the forecasts that we received, in which the numbers that we're both quoting are based on, show they call it a U-shaped recovery. So there's no anticipation that everything's going to go back to normal in August in terms of the economy or state revenues. We're really looking at more of a 3 to 4 year recovery in terms of public health confidence and jobs. We could be pleasantly surprised, but the economists aren't showing that nationwide or globally. And the state's projections are based on a compilation of economic models that are put together by different economists around the country, around the world. So it's just really unknown. And what you don't want is starts and stops to the economy, which is why a lot of states are taking the phased approach that we're taking, where you open it up a little, see how it goes, open it up some more, see how it goes. Because what would be disastrous is to open it up and then people get sick and we all get sent scurrying back to our homes again.
Q&A and chat, so I encourage folks to keep filling those out, but I want to take a moment to bring in one of our other panelists, and we've got many more questions for Senator Rolfes here, but I want to make sure that our next guest, Senator Mark Mullet of Issaquah, joins us. He was first elected to the Senate in 2012 and is now the chair of the Senate Financial Institutions and Economic Development Committee. He's a former city council member as well as a well-known small businessman here on the East Side, and I want to welcome Mark Mullet to our webcast. He was able to, there he is.
Technology worked, which for me is a miracle.
Excellent. You are here. Great job. Well, Mark, it's interesting because you look at, I used to do the titles and the organizational structure for Senate committees and things like that. And economic development was, I don't mean to be negative about it, but in some cases it almost felt like a throwaway term in which committee should be dealing with it and what it really is the state's role in doing so. But now economic development has become, the buzzword for probably the next 2 years. How are you approaching that task, and what ideas are percolating up for how you can get the economy back up and running again?
I think I was one of the Senate reps on the committee to work with the governor's office to find safe ways for people to get back to work. And so I think, to be really blunt, the short-term focus is to do exactly that. And so we made a huge push going back to April to get construction restarted, to get elective surgeries restarted. Those seem to be two areas that were having really huge negative impacts on the state. Outdoor recreation, car sales, car washes, all those other things. These were all things that this committee focused on, and basically told Ensley, we will provide legislative public support for us to reopen these businesses safely as quickly as possible. And I think in the short term, like to your question to Senator Rolfes, like when we looked at car sales, it's $20 to $40 million a week of state tax revenue if car sales are shut down. And so I think that there is definitely, in terms of economic development for our state, the finding safe ways to go back to work right now is the number one focus we can have, because the more industries we can get back to work in a safe fashion, the quicker our tax revenues will recover, and the more people will be able to sustain themselves without working for the government to keep them afloat. But that being said, the committee was disbanded last week. That was super frustrating. And it's, I think my frustration is I think the idea of getting people back to work safely has turned into too much of a partisan battle. I think you can feel strongly about wanting people to go back to work safely and not have a complete disregard for public health. I think you can definitely balance those interests, and I'm hopeful. I really want to see the state of Washington provide the same leadership of finding safe ways to get people back to work that we did in terms of being quick to shut our economy down back in March, which I think was the right decision because we had no idea what was coming at us. But I think by the time we got to the second week of April, it became a little more clear, I think, to the legislature that our hospital system was in a better position to handle things going forward. And so I think once we got to that point, then we really started to push to find safe ways to get people back to work. And this is going to be a balancing act, but I would like to see phase 2 start on May 26th, and I'd like to see it start in a much smoother way than phase 1 did, in the sense that all the industries know exactly what guidelines they should follow so they could open the Tuesday after Memorial Day and not be worried about having further delays.
Tell me, you're obviously a small business owner, and in a retail capacity where you've got folks coming in and out of your store. How are the guidelines being generated for how you're supposed to operate? Do you know how much personal protective equipment you need to provide your staff, or that your staff needs to bring? Do you know whether or not customers must be required to wear masks? Is that a decision you get to make? Are the standards for your opening clear?
So one advantage the restaurant business had is, restaurants are full of gloves and tons of sanitation. It's just the nature of the restaurant business. And so I think in our industry, it's a little bit easier. And obviously, like, my pizza restaurant never closed down. It, pickup and delivery stayed open. My Bell Square Ben & Jerry's is still closed. By the way, if Puget Sound Energy is on this line, the Kirkland Ben & Jerry's called during the middle of this webinar, and I guess the power in Kirkland is out. So that's never good for ice cream. So
yes, that is why we are having. That's why we're going to stretch our questions of you and Senator Rolfes, because while we had Amy Walen on the line before the start of it, her power went out, and so now she's trying to get on through a cell phone.
My staff at Kirkland store is freaking out as well. But no, I think that but working with the Restaurant Association, the governor's office did engage the Hospitality Association, and so the rules that have been laid out that would apply for a phase 2 reopening, which hopefully will stay on track for May 26th. I think for the restaurants right now, it would be fairly clear. And that's 6-foot distance between tables. and you can't sit at a bar, you're only at 50% capacity, and all these guidelines. And so I think that is good. I think in the car wash example and some of these other, like with construction, we had some real bumps in the road in terms of how we rolled out the guidelines. So hopefully we've learned from that, and we'll get moving. So.
One last question on kind of the restaurant, small business angle, and specific to restaurants. A lot of our members that are restaurants are talking about, even if the restrictions are lifted, the new capacity requirements of 50% capacity, 75% capacity, and this is not by any means saying that those aren't required by public health for valid public health reasons, but can your restaurant survive at only 50% capacity? At what point is it not profitable to open?
Well, I think people are. You're hitting the nail on the head. This is going to be a challenge, and I think that. I know our Ways and Means update, we assume I think the Congressional Budget Office is assuming at the end of 21, there's still 9.7% unemployment or something. And that's, the national level. And so I think everyone realizes that, I know one of my local restaurants out here in Sammamish, a pizza/brewery place called Kryptonite, they already announced, they were in the Seattle Times yesterday, they're not reopening because they've made that calculation you just explained. And so I think that is going to be a real challenge. Why I think, I am supportive of the legislature going back into session in June to reduce spending, because I think we're going to have a real long-term economic impact on the negative side for the next 2 years. And I think we're going to have to get in front of it as quickly as possible. So I think there's a lot of businesses that won't be around at the end of the year. It's the quote from the guy in the paper in Sammamish was, "Hope is not a business plan." And I can understand his challenges and frustration.
Switching over to budget and revenues for a moment, you sponsored a property tax cut to offset some of the big increases from the 2018 basic education funding package. What's your expectations about property tax collections, and in particular, how much is it possible that school funding could take some of the brunt of the inevitable budget cuts that are coming?
Well, I think that the property, my guess is, obviously, I don't see any taxes. It's hard for the state to provide tax relief. To put things in perspective, the state got $14 billion of PPP loans. We're almost at $900 million a week in unemployment benefits being paid out. So when we look at this stuff, like Senator Rolfes pointed out, we do $200 million for coronavirus out of the rainy day fund. And to be honest, that is a drop in the bucket compared to the size of our economy. And so I think the challenge of state is I don't foresee us being able to help out from a tax perspective. In terms of tax collections, property taxes are probably one of the most reliable ways to collect revenue, obviously, during a recession. The sales tax is going to be where our nightmare is, and B&O tax is also going to be down. But I think the sales tax component of it is the one that's causing the most anxiety. And I think the real challenge the legislature has is I don't think there's a way you could tax your way out of this, because every industry in the state has been really decimated. And I think the industries that haven't been decimated, who are more technology focused, what we've learned in the past is if you try to put all the burden on them, it's so easy for them to route their sales through subsidiaries in other states that you end up with nothing. And so we have this fine line of trying to figure out, I don't know what businesses we could go after. That's why I think we're really going to have to focus on difficult spending decisions at the state level. And as Senator Rolfes said, K-12 is kind of off limits. And so the challenge of that is it really puts higher ed and early learning, things we know that are extremely important, on the dartboard. And so that's not a good place to land, because those programs are very important. And that's why I think we have to come back as soon as we can to Olympia and find ways. I think there's a real chance if we showed up in June, we could institute like a 2-week, state employee furlough program for August. And that I think would be a smart decision. I think the upcoming the 3% increase for state employees should probably be only targeted towards people who've been having to work through this crisis because they're an essential worker, like they're in healthcare space or public security space. And I think some of those decisions we should probably show up in June and make now to reduce spending as quickly as possible.
I've got one question that keeps popping up here from viewers that I'll put to everybody here in a moment, but I'll start with you, Mark. There's a lot of conversation about the tax structure, about whether we're too reliant on property taxes and sales taxes, whether it's regressive, and there's been a number of proposals out there to institute everything from capital gains income tax to a standard income tax to increases in transaction fees like the like the tax that was passed, last year on property sales. My question is there an effort to that could be seriously taken under this current circumstance that could lead to seeing a shift in our tax structure and enough legislators finding support for a significant shift in the way our taxes are structured? And what are the experience of other states that would have that different tax structure? How are they faring right now under COVID?
Well, I think you'll get a wide variety of answers. I think my answer will probably be different than a lot of my colleagues in the Democratic caucus. But I mean, California is freaking out because they do have a capital gains tax, and that's their first line item that they're saying they think is going to get completely annihilated. And even if Washington were to pass a capital gains tax, I mean, if you passed it in the 21 session, it would be something that would probably go into effect in the 22 tax year, which means you'd be collecting money and when people file their federal taxes in the spring of 2023. I mean, the state is literally out of money by June 30th of 2021. And so I think people who think capital gains tax is our solution to this crisis, it's not going to line up. And I think the sales tax is the component of our tax system that is undoubtedly regressive. I think the challenge we always have is every time we talk about, raising other revenues to try to reduce sales tax, it ends up not going anywhere. I think people end up raising other revenues and the sales tax stays the same. I mean, our sales tax, the state portion of sales tax has been the same level going back to the 80s now. All the additions in sales tax haven't come from the state. They come from, the ability for local jurisdictions like Sound Transit, which I've supported those sales tax additions, but that's where our state sales tax increases have come from, not the state 6.5% that we collect. And so I think that I don't see a path right now between now and in a special session or in the upcoming session of 2021 to completely reform our tax code. I think we have a crisis in terms of we're going to be broke and out of money, and we have to find a way to reduce spending as quickly as possible, very quickly.
Last question for you, and then I think we're able to move on to Amy here in a moment. But last session, there was a increase in the out-of-state bank B&O tax, and a Superior Court judge in King County then this last week ruled that provision unconstitutional. What was your sense about the judge's ruling, and did that make sense? And what was the kind of genesis of the policy?
Well, I think that it kind of just shows the challenges of, legislation that happens the last week of session that doesn't go through a normal process. A lot of times, I think if that piece of legislation had gone through the normal process, that legal obstacle would have come up very early on during committee hearings. And so I'm not surprised that the judge said it was unconstitutional. I think it was a summary judgment ruling. It wasn't even, he didn't really think there was much debate about it being a violation of the Commerce Clause. He seemed like it was a pretty black and white issue. So, I think it just highlights the importance of having bills go through the traditional legislative process where they're introduced. They go through their committees, they go to the other chamber, they go through those committees. And the beauty of that process is when things like this that are a clear violation of the Commerce Clause are in there, I think they get sussed out through that process. And the bank tax bill, obviously because it was rushed at the last minute, didn't have the luxury of having that happen. But I mean, I don't know if it's going to be appealed. I don't know what's going to happen with that. So obviously the King County judge has obviously ruled it was a violation. And so I'm kind of waiting for the next update. And I haven't received it yet. And I feel like I'm paused. Joe, you're supposed to save me right now.
Seem to discover the refresh button on my browser, unfortunately. The question...
You've taken your black background screen to a whole different level, because now that's all I see.
It's very black right now. Well, last question, and then we'll bring on Amy. What's your economic sense, big picture? Is it a U shape? Is it a V shape? Is it just too early to tell?
I think it's going to be long and miserable. That's my honest opinion. And I'm the Senate rep on the state investment board, and we got an update a couple of weeks ago, and he said it's unlike anything, and he's been doing investment management stuff for 30 years. He said there's businesses that are out of money now who are doing long-term structured deals to get access to cash, because otherwise they realize they're going to fold. And he said they're paying really high rates for access to cash, like 10, 12, 14%. Then he's like, I switch over to the public equity markets, and the public equity markets are pricing in a virus by the end of 2020 and life back to normal. And so he's like, somebody's not right. He's like, there's definitely parts of the market that are assuming this is going to be really long and drawn out. Public equities is definitely assuming it's going to be a really quick recovery. I'm much more nervous, and I think it's going to be a long, drawn out process. And yeah, I think we really have to prepare for a reduced level of economic activity for the next 2 years.
Well, Mark, appreciate it. I'm sure we've got some more questions for you in a moment, but what I want to do right now is turn over to Amy, who I hope has joined us by phone. She is in the heart of the Kirkland, where it sounds like we've got some power issues, but I've also seen many of our Puget Sound Energy folks that are on this call right now saying that they are on top of it and will get power restored quickly. But again, I want to start by introducing here Amy Walen. She's represents Bellevue Redmond in the Points community and is a former Kirkland mayor. She's also a former Australian lawyer, which I thought was a very interesting factoid. She and her husband still operate a successful auto dealership on the east side, which is essential for her ability to represent small businesses in her role as vice chair of the House Finance Committee, of course, the committee in charge of all things taxes. Amy, welcome. How are you today?
Good morning, Joe. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It was kind of a crazy time figuring out why my answer.
Well, I know that you've got a little tough reception there at your house, so hopefully we'll be able to stay connected here for a couple of questions. But let's just start high level. You're like Mark, you're a small business owner, and you're in an industry that's had a lot of ups and downs lately, as there's been a lot of regulations around how do you maintain safe operations and keep them operating. And also, as Mark said, it's a huge revenue generator for the state of Washington. How is your business doing, and how have you had to make changes to stay in operation?
Yeah, it's it's an unprecedented time, and I know that we're all just doing the best we can to lead and to make sure that we bring people back to work safely. What's been I'm very cautious about just complaining, right? But I'm going to complain a little bit. Maybe it'll sound like complaining, but we laid off 77 of our 100 employees, and it's a time of great stress for our team members, for our business. There hasn't been a lot of certainty for auto dealers about how we can just recently got some governor guidelines. The parts and service departments were always open as an essential business, just keeping people moving, right? And then we were able to sell a few vehicles just to people who were like we sold very limited circumstances. So typically, we would generate $10 million in sales tax revenue plus B&O taxes of about $65,000 a month. And that's obviously gone to, maybe 1/10 of our collections are about 1/10 of what we would typically see. We were able to get the PPP loan, but I haven't been able to bring on a lot of people. One, because there's a lot of uncertainty. Some of our team don't want to come back to work, and their unemployment benefits keep them secure, which is a good thing. And then the other challenge has been, not having clear guidelines up until now, and how what do we know about our business? Usually we're able to sort of plan for a certain amount of volume, and we haven't been able to do that. So we're trying really hard to comply with the governor's guidelines to maximize our use of the PPP loan. I do want to flag, I know I flagged for you, Joe, and I want to flag for your members, and I discussed this with Senator Mullet, that the Department of Revenue thinks that the PPP forgivable portion of the loan is not going to be subject to B&O tax, but we need to clarify that by legislative action. So we're preparing a bill to make sure that's clear. But I think it's important that people know that it's possible that the Department of Revenue could ultimately someday find, if we don't take legislative action, that forgivable portion is taxable. So that would be an unpleasant surprise, right? If you used it all to pay your people and pay your rent, and then the state said, oh, by the way, you owe us B&O taxes on that. So I think that's an important issue to flag, and I'll continue to talk about it. But yeah, it's a challenging time, and I want to be sensitive to your members' questions, so I'll leave it there. But we're just doing our best one day. Yeah, I'm a part of a group that is sort of a subgroup of the Finance Committee looking at accelerating the work of the tax structure work group. That's a 3-year or maybe even 4-year study group that's talking about our tax structure and how it is regressive and makes poor people pay more taxes. And I agree with that. I think that it's going to be really tough, and certainly won't happen in a special session, that we restructure our work group. But I do think that we have a pause, right, in how we do everything. People can work from home more. People can run campaigns without being out on doors. I mean, that we can gather and communicate with each other in different ways. I think we are at a place where we can pause and look at how we collect taxes, because this is going to be a radical, terrible budget, and we're going to have to do terrible things to get by. So I am interested in progressive tax reform, but it's not the time to do things to anything to our small business community. One thing that I think that's positive that's come out of this is that we really have tapped into the love that people have for their business community. There has always been this sort of choice, that's a false choice in my opinion, that we make where we favor people or we favor business. And I just think that is a false choice. And we really are seeing that the vast majority of our economy is generated by our small business community, and we are going to see small businesses folding left and right. I mean, I can tell you from our perspective, my husband hates it when I say this, but 3 or 4 months we can do this. 6 months we cannot do this anymore, and that's going to happen. And our business would close, and those 100 jobs would go away for good. So I guess what my message has been in the tax structure work group is that this is our chance to be the hero for the business community. And if we're going to make a change, what I would like to see is to eliminate the B&O tax and go to some other kind of taxation of business. We have to tax our business community, but the B&O tax is incredibly regressive and wrong, and we should go to some sort of profit tax. Now, I know that has constitutional problems, but if we were going to take on a constitutionally challenging issue, maybe this would be the time to do it. So, but there's a lot of conversation in our caucus, and I'm only speaking for myself here, a lot of conversation about how this is the time to completely change our tax code. To me, capital gains is going to be very difficult because, again, this is a lot of small business owners, their entire retirement is their small business. And so do we really want to hit them with a capital gains tax? And also, the market's really down in the toilet. So then is this the time that we want to introduce a capital gains tax? I think those conversations are politically and just humanly really difficult. So I guess that I'd like to see us just work on the business piece and then have a long-term strategy to do more. So those are kind of my thoughts, but there's a lot of. Yeah, I'm interested in that as well. I honestly don't have a handle on what sort of health our unemployment insurance fund is. I'm assured that we are solvent and we are healthy, but I honestly think we have some transparency issues here, because I'm getting a lot of questions about that too. And we are just, the burn rate of how much we're spending is just stunning. It's from the employer perspective, and this is in my own family. I have a family member who said, I get $800 a week on unemployment plus the $600 stimulus, so that's $1,400 a month or a week. So why would I come back to work, when I'm uncomfortable about the virus? And I know that sort of sounds, I don't know. I have to be careful about how I make that sound, but it's not appealing to people to come back to work when they are making a lot of money on unemployment, honestly. And I definitely believe we have to keep money in people's pockets to keep the economy going, because what happened in the Depression is people didn't have any money. And so they didn't spend any money. There was no demand. And then it was sort of a downward spiral where we lost jobs and businesses. And I don't want that to happen. But I'm worried on two fronts. There's not a lot of excitement about going back to work. And there's also the insolvency of the fund that we have to worry about. I think this is a time when there's more conversations going on about going into some kind of debt. We have the balanced budget requirement in our state, and I know that there are conversations about going in some kind of balance out or tap our bond capacity to try to sort of even out this time that we're going through. But the uncertainty of how long this goes on for makes it really difficult to think about. So I don't think I've answered your question, Joe, but that's sort of what's on my mind. So Joe just asked me what my prediction is for the recovery. And I think that there's a lot of pent up demand. And I think that people are extremely anxious to get back to eating Ben & Jerry's ice cream and go out to a restaurant and go do fun things with their families and spend money. And because we have had pretty solid investment in most of our workforce, not all, obviously, undocumented other people, there's holes for sure. But because people have had some safety net and a lot of people have worked from home and our economy is very diverse with tech, and we're probably come out of this better in our state than many other states will because of that. There's pent up demand. People want to spend money, but I think it's going to be long and bumpy. I just think there's too much uncertainty. If we knew what the virus was going to do, it would be better if we thought that this was over. But I think it's becoming pretty clear that this it's going to be at least 2 years before we're sort of through the virus part, and then the recovery will be slow. And maybe our economy will look very different. I don't know. Are cruise ships going to come back? Is Boeing going to be doing what it's doing? People are saying that this may forever change how people move about, how they recreate, how they world.
Well, I want to move over to Senator Rolfes again, and hopefully folks are able to hear me now, as I've also had to call out on my cell phone. But Senator, we've got a ton of questions that have come in regarding local revenue shares and support for cities and counties. What are we expecting the state to be able to maintain or do to support local governments at this time?
Okay, Joe, you were echoing. Am I echoing?
No.
Okay. So I think what you asked is what we're going to be able to do to support support local governments at this time. So here I have. Can I first address the unemployment question?
Please.
Before we move on, because that is something that the Senate Ways and Means Committee is tracking. So here's the information as I know it. I'm reading this off my phone. The trust fund balance is currently $3.9 billion. We're one of the most solvent in the country, and it's expected to grow a little bit even with this downturn through May. So we're at almost $4 billion. If we assume a 25% unemployment rate through 2020, and then 15% in the fourth quarter, 20% this spring and summer, 15% in the fall, we should not exhaust our trust fund. There have been news accounts about spend rate. The spend rate is mostly federal money. So those benefits of an additional $600 a month or $600 a week, and the benefits for certain people who otherwise wouldn't be qualified are all coming from federal sources. So although the fund is spending money, much of that is federal. If we were to run out of money, the unemployment program is mostly a federal program. There is a loan program with low interest loans from the federal government, and it is assumed that Washington State, because of the financial situation that we sit in, would have a low interest rate. And if Congress were to be generous, we'd probably be one of the states with, a zero interest rate. So although there is general concern, the concern is manageable on that. As far as assistance to local governments, I've been pretty consistent with local government throughout the state. I've been on a number of webinars and conference calls. The federal government sent out some money to local government. The state will not have money to bail governments out. I heard a lot early on from my district of, you've got the rainy day fund, we're going to need some of it. The rainy day fund wasn't, we'll be using that to save healthcare and public schools. It's not likely that much of it will be used for bailing out local governments. So as bad as that news is, what I have been asking local governments to do is come to the state with your needs, not your wants. And we will approach this as a team and figure out what we need to do.
There has been a lot of. Am I echoing again? How about now? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. There's been a lot of money that's been put into higher ed recently, and the question is that amount of investment maintainable, especially the funding that's been put towards the scholarships to allow low-income kids to be able to access our in-state four-year institutions?
I think that's, it comes down to, that's going to be a political question, right? So one of the things, and this is something that the legislature is going to have to grapple with, is we're going to have tremendous pressure, and I think we're going to want to take care of immediate needs. And the needs that we're going to be seeing in July when people's federal unemployment runs out are probably going to be very, very basic. Shelter, food, healthcare, right? And so what priority will those have as the legislature goes through its exercise? I'm guessing great priority. But similarly, we always look at recessions in terms of how do we position ourselves coming out of the recession. And so much of the higher education investments were in helping low-income people get financial assistance so they could attend college or technical schools. Is that something we want to cut in a recession when people are out of jobs and looking at building their schools? Probably not. Do we want to expand it at the rate we were planning on expanding it? That's probably up for discussion. Ironically, one of the things we invested in a good way was last year was more training for nurses. And so we're seeing in a lot of the community colleges, nurses coming out of programs that hadn't been fully funded and hadn't been in place. So that timing was perfect in terms of the workforce there. But everything's going to be on the table, Joe.
Sounds like it. One of our former colleagues asked an interesting question about the impact on the state budget from so many of our major employers continuing to telework even well after the restrictions are lifted by the governor. Is there any sense about how that will impact revenues?
That's one of those economic forecast issues that I don't know that is built into any models yet, but I saw that question in the Q&A. They're probably, the pundits, economists are talking about the change across America in work patterns and what that will do to lease rate, office space, and the money that people make through commercial real estate transactions. So there will likely be an impact there. And then if you have, for example, Amazon with more people working from home, that does impact the downtown economies in terms of people eating out, getting coffee, doing their dry cleaning. Dry cleaning is probably something that we'll see a contraction. Universal support for how the governor was doing his job. I don't know that there's universal disagreement about how he's doing the job either. But I think it was last year when we left Olympia, we had nobody anticipated how long this would be going on, and so there was no conversation about when do we come back, what's the checks and balances. Nobody had any idea how much money would be coming from the federal government, and what's the authority of right now for the executive agencies to be spending that money without legislative oversight. When last year in 2019, I think it was, we passed, Senator Zeiger had an emergency operations bill that ironically, the governor has always had emergency powers, but Senator Zeiger's bill added human caused to it. And at the time we were all thinking terrorism, nobody was thinking pandemic, but pandemic is exactly what that's for. So ironically, I'm just going to point out the irony here. It was a Republican bill that gave the governor all these powers. And ironically, it was Senator Hasagawa, who's one of the most liberal members of the Senate, who inserted language to make sure that people could peacefully protest and that those rights were not part of the governor's emergency declaration. So there's an irony here of related to the partisan politics going on right now. But clearly, I think there is going to need to be a conversation about that particular bill and what amendments we might want to make to it moving forward.
Hear me right now, and I certainly want to thank Senator Rolfes, Senator Mullet, Representative Walen, and taking the time to share their thoughts with us and for their steady leadership during these difficult months ahead. I've worked really close with these three legislators over the years, and I've been very impressed with their ability to lead the community and their state in such a responsible way. I hope you'll join us next Tuesday at 9:30 for another visit with state leaders, this time with a powerful pair from Mercer Island, Senate Education Chair Lisa Wellman and Representative Tana Sen, as well as newcomer Representative Carolyn Eslick, as they look at human services, early education, and the strain that this pandemic has put on our social safety net. This Thursday afternoon, the Bellevue Chamber will continue its Back to Work series with PPE, social distancing, and the new office with workplace consultants and real estate experts from Herman Miller and Kidder Matthews. You can find all of these upcoming webcasts, as well as our previous 12 programs on demand at eastkingchambers.org or at bellevuechamber.org, or at the conclusion of today's webcast. As always, stay healthy, stay safe, and I hope that we will see you on Thursday, and I hope very much that you will also hear us on Thursday. Thanks for coming.